Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we are kind of finishing up our Federalist Papers run that we've had, and we have Dr. Sean Beienberg back with us. And Dr. Beienberg, our question today is, why is it that judges, legal scholars still reference the Federalist Papers in court decisions? Because they're not governing documents, but there is still references to the Federalist Papers.
You're absolutely right that the Federalist Papers are indeed a very frequently cited text in a constitutional adjudication by judges and legal scholars. And that's not to say that they haven't been cited before, but this is actually something that is increasingly frequent, where the Federalist Papers are increasingly a sort of a core capstone in terms of judicial interpretation in the last few decades, whereas they'd fallen out of favor for a while. And that largely is a consequence of two things. So, as we talked about before, the Federalist Papers are just a brilliant set of interpretive analyses of the constitutional text. That is to say, they understand the Constitution very well. And whereas the Constitution as a governing document is very sparse in many ways, the Federalist Papers do a terrific job sort of articulating and explaining the logic, the institutional design, the purposes of those institutional arrangements. This is why, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America basically says in footnotes, just go read the Federalist Papers. They do this better than I can do. There are a few places where Tocqueville actually articulates things a little more clearly than the Federalist. I think because in some sense, not unreasonably, they have certain background assumptions in mind. We've talked before about how they don't really define executive power very carefully because they all kind of like look around and like, we know what the executive power looks like. Whereas Tocqueville has a little bit more distance to then feel the need to go and explain some of that. So Democracy in America also does a really good job of explaining a lot of that as well. So there's just an element of, it's a very eloquent articulation of the logic of the Constitution. The other reason is that the Federalist is arguably the most effective or clearest articulation of, and the legal scholars would sort of pick this apart here with the nuances, but something akin to the original understanding or the original intent of the Constitution. I will spare you folks the arcana of like high-level constitutional theory, but the basic idea of one of the main canons of constitutional interpretation, which was really, really popular and basically one of the main ways people did constitutional interpretation pretty much through the 1930s. It wasn't exclusively, but it was one of the mainstream measures of doing that, is trying to understand basically what the text was supposed to do at the time that it was written. How is this understood? There's a little bit of nuance between whether you care more about what the writers and the drafters wrote versus a sort of popular understanding. But that was really what legal interpretation did for most of American history. It falls off in the 1930s through the 70s or 80s. It gets sort of brought back, particularly under the term originalism. Now, originalism as a word is not used until quite recently, but as a concept, if you sort of go back and read legal cases, they're clearly articulating the sort of basic idea of like, what did the convention think that they were ratifying? What are these words supposed to be doing? So the term is new. The sort of legal interpretive canon is very, very old. And particularly as there is more interest in originalism, particularly, but not exclusively among more, I hate to use the term, but conservative-leaning justices and judges, there's a greater interest in originalism. And if you're doing that, then the Federalist Papers, as we've talked about before, not everybody in every state was reading them, but they're sort of a nice collection of the understandings that were being discussed about, if you sign your Constitution, it's going to do X, Y, and Z. Here's what we're trying to do with that. So they serve as probably after contemporaneous like dictionary definitions or something to understand what a phrase means, or maybe other sort of contemporary legal cases. But they're one of the best sources of text that one can look to in trying to understand, at least for those who care about such things, sort of what the generation drafting, writing, ratifying, and serving, working with this Constitution thought it meant at the time. And there's this one little other sort of con law articulation on this. So James Madison, for example, was always defending originalism as the proper way to do constitutional interpretation. But he said, and this is quite interesting, that you don't care so much about what the drafters privately thought they were doing. So Madison actually resisted releasing the records of the Constitutional Convention because he said nobody really knew what our sort of private thoughts were. Nobody was signing off on that. What matters, he says, in a few letters and texts and speeches he gives, is basically what did the people signing the dotted line think that they were signing? That's how you do a lot of other contract law, but sort of what did the people think they were agreeing to? That's what we should continue to be bound by. And so the Federalist Papers, like some of the other ratifying convention debates, serve as a really good articulation of that. Again, they're not complete in every feature. There are places where they're not commenting on a problem, or a problem comes up that they weren't anticipating and discussing, but they're pretty thorough in describing a lot of the institutional arrangements.
Is there, because I know that there are justices and judges who kind of stick with the originalism, the original meaning of what the Constitution was saying. Are they more likely to utilize things like the Federalist Papers in their writings?
Certainly they are. And again, I said that that's particularly but not exclusively common among more conservative justices. Arguably one of the greatest originalist justices in U.S. history was Hugo Black, who was regarded as one of the most progressive justices. His interpretations of the Commerce Clause he wasn't being that probably originalist on that and a few other places in some ways, but very, very aggressive in trying to understand, particularly on civil liberties issues, I would say, the original understanding. Now, the Federalist Papers are not very good for civil liberties issues because the Bill of Rights obviously postdates the discussion in the Federalist. But originalism as a methodology is not exclusive to conservatives. It's just worth noting that. But which creates kind of an interesting thing where you have Clarence Thomas citing Hugo Black, who one is quoted as the right-wing most justice, and the other one is probably the second most left-wing justice of his era. But yeah, as folks who are originalists are certainly the ones that are going to be interested in the most, but they're not the only ones that cite it. I mean, other justices who would not define themselves as primarily originalist will still make originalist arguments, and they will still invoke the Federalist, for example. So constitutional interpretation, there are lots of different parts of it. And even within judges who have similar philosophies, they'll rank things a little differently. So just as an example of that, what do you do if there's a tension between the original understanding as articulated in the Federalist versus precedents, right? So even judges who would describe themselves as originalists will sort of weigh those differently. Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia famously debated quite extensively on this, whereas Thomas would always say, look, the original understanding of the Constitution is what is the highest value. If there's a bad precedent, I don't care how many decades of precedents are bad, how many precedents are bad. Like my oath is to the Constitution. Whereas Scalia would say, well, we're this mixed sort of common law and constitutional thing, so we have to be deferential to precedent. So the Federalist Papers are, not an immediate conversation winner for other than maybe for Clarence Thomas, but even somebody who's not associated with originalist perspective will generally still find the Federalist Papers, at least, if not, knock down immediate conversation ender, a major piece of evidence of constitutional understanding.
Fantastic. Dr. Beienberg, as always, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.